Here we are at 111 Varick Street in Soho, and let's talk about this Soho rezoning. What's going on?
So SoHo, the zoning resolution that affects the whole city was put in place in 1961. It has been revised all over the city except for SoHo.
Why?
Well, it was intended for there to be a highway to go through the middle of SoHo, which then didn't happen.
Really? I didn't know that.
Of course, this was a Robert Moses plan, was to build a highway that connects the Manhattan Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge to the Holland Tunnel, called the Lower Manhattan Expressway, that was supposed to go across Broome Street.
What a terrible idea.
Well, because there's never any traffic in Canal Street. So right now we have 12 bridges and tunnels that dump you into the streets of Manhattan, right? And there's, if you add up the 4 million people who live in Brooklyn and the 2.5 million people who live in Queens and the other 5 million people who live on Long Island, you have roughly 10 million people whose connection to the rest of the planet, to the rest of the United States
is through Canal Street.
Is through Canal Street. So, why would there be traffic?
Right.
There's no one who would master plan the city of New York today.
Right.
And not having some kind of highway that would connect the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, and the Williamsburg Bridge
to the power broker tried to do it.
And to connect the 59th Street Bridge in Queens Midtown Tunnel to the Lincoln Tunnel, right? But none of that exists today. Instead, what we have is SoHo, and actually going back to Jane Jacobs, who fought Robert Moses to prevent the building of that expressway, SoHo has been a very organized community to prevent any change. So until recently, we've had this zoning from the 1960s that's been governing SoHo. So it might seem absurd, but the zoning in SoHo prohibits restaurants. The zoning in SoHo prohibits retail sales.
Except it's SoHo.
except in every instance. So what's happened is literally at every place you see a restaurant and every place you see retail, those landowners had to go to the Bureau of Standards and Appeal and say, I can no longer rent out my building as a typewriter repair facility, and I would like to use it, because that's actually a legal use under the zone.
Typewriter repair.
Typewriter repair. Light manufacturing is permitted, but
was New York at one point the typewriter repair
capital of the world? I'm sure it was.
Interesting.
SoHo was the printing. Printing
district.
Yeah, printing district.
So the rezoning has now made residential housing legal. It was not legal before. Has made retail legal, which was not legal before. Has made restaurants legal that were not legal before. And as part of the residential use, if you build residential housing, it has to be 25% mandatory inclusionary housing. So you have to build.
That means is 25% of the building has to be for affordable uses.
That's right, forever.
Forever.
Right. So it's if you want to build 1 foot, you have to build 1.25 feet, and that 1/4 feet is affordable forever. Get someone to do it, right? You have to give them a tax abatement for some period of time, which goes back to 421A. There are people who are against the rezoning, typically revolving around this issue of joint live-work artists in residence housing. So there's this odd provision in the zoning to allow artists to live and work in a loft type space, and that was legal residential housing. But you had to be certified by the city as an artist.
Have you ever seen what that certification entails?
No. So there have been lots of people.
It's very limited.
Right. So there have been a lot of people living in SoHo in illegal housing. Essentially, they're not artists, but they've been living in these loft buildings as if it was a legal residential building.
I think there's 500 buildings, mainly in SoHo, that have that designation.
That's right. So at 56 blocks. There are 56 blocks in the city, all of them around SoHo. So there's people who want to stop it who are against the rezoning, because for you to convert your illegal apartment into a legal apartment, you have to pay into an arts fund $100 a square foot fee. So if you have a 2,000 square foot apartment,
$200,000.
You have to pay $200,000 to pay it into an artist fee to convert your illegal apartment into a legal apartment.
It's basically a tax
That's right, to convert the unit.
to convert the unit. But if you bought it when you were an artist, it was probably like a $64,000 apartment, and now it's probably worth $6 million.
That's right. So if you had a $2,000 apartment, if you had a 2,000 square foot 2-bedroom,
Which a lot of these lofts are.
that's
Yes.
right. So
they're big.
you probably have an apartment worth $2 to $3 million,
If not more.
if not more. And would it be worth $200,000 to convert it into a legal residence?
I would say yes.
Yes, but I would say that it's better to force them to do it based on a transaction or a death. They should
there is-
grandfather the people in there that currently own them and say, if you sell it, you need to pay the city here as a tax.
A transfer tax. That's not how it's being done. It's
That's not
being,
how it's saying you need it up front, right?
Well, right now, people are living in illegal apartments.
Yes, but they've been living there for 30 years and the city's never done anything.
That's
As a
right.
position, they've never done anything.
That's right. And nothing's happening now. That hasn't changed. People are worried that it will, and that the city will suddenly be enforcing the law. And if they do that, then they'll be forced to pay this fee. Even though that's not a requirement, you're not obligated to convert your illegal apartment into a legal apartment, but there's some risk that it could happen.
Well, it's probably, at least the risk is, there's a monetary definition of what that risk is.
That's
whereas
right.
before it was, could I get kicked out of my house?
Sure.
Which is, I guess, a step in the right direction. But if we get back to, progressive politicians, it would appear that it would be more likely that they would try and go after that money.
Sure.
But couldn't they make it more of like a transfer tax and sort of relieve some of the fear?
They could, and I actually believe that you should legalize those spaces, and I think that's a good way to legalize those spaces. But it should be based on some sort of transaction, right? A sale of the property to legalize it, and they should grandfather people that are there that they don't have to actually pay that until they sell, or they die and it goes to goes to an estate sale or something like that.
The problem is in zoning, right? There is no zoning is based on a transaction. There is zoning that kicks into place if there's a change in use. And going from an illegal unit to a legal unit is a change in use. It's going from a loft artist space to residential housing. So it's tough, though, to argue that your illegal apartment, let's say you've had it for 20 years, you've gotten the benefit of breaking the law for 20 years, and now you're upset because someone's going to stop you from breaking the law and giving you an opportunity to pay your way out of it. It seems to me like if you stop me from robbing a bank, I don't get to sue you to get the money I didn't get out of the till.
Hold on though, but in real estate there is lots of precedent that, like, if I'm living on a piece of land that's not mine for a certain amount of time, or squatting for that matter, like, it becomes yours.
That's a much more complicated conversation than people know.
Okay.
It needs to be something called adverse possession. The person who owned the land has to have known that you were there illegally and that they explicitly gave up the right to you. Just that because you live in a place illegally for 7 years or longer doesn't mean it becomes yours. That really doesn't exist other than...
So are we saying this whole SoHo's rezoning is being held back really just because of these landowners?
The AIR.
It's not being held back. It passed. It went through ULURP. It passed by the city council. It's in effect today.
But there are some lawsuits right now.
Which that's happening. But the history of the city is you can sue the city to say you can't rezone an area of your city, but there's not a lot of history of that being successful. There are a lot of private rezonings. I have a piece of land, I want to build an extra 10 stories on it.
No.
I go through a rezoning, whether it's passed or not. There are lots of examples of communities stopping private rezonings. Examples of communities or people stopping city rezonings, not a lot of history of that. Happened in Inwood, right, where a judge in Inwood stopped the rezoning of Inwood for a while. She was overruled in the.
Well, they tried to stop it in Gowanus too. That failed.
Right, but that's a private rezoning.
Didn't they try and stop at Midtown too? But that I mean, obviously
It failed, right? So
I know.
there's
there's very large buildings being built.
correct, exactly right. So I think it's unlikely a judge is going to stop the development on 56 blocks in the city of New York.
And because the city desperately needs that affordable housing.
Correct.
What's the future SoHo going to look like?
I think the future
Walmart and
so that's
60-story towers.
That's more BS, right? So that's more BS. So there have been people, if you listen to people who are in opposition to the SoHo rezoning, they'll say, well, it's going to allow big box retail, which in your mind says, Walmart. But big box retail in what they're talking about is 10,000 square feet, right? So what you can, under the new rezoning, you can build retail as large as 10,000 square feet.
And you know what 10,000 square feet's good for? A Gucci. That's what SoHo. That's what SoHo needs.
It's not good for a Walmart. Having built Walmarts, they're like 100,000 square feet. So there is no big box retail coming to SoHo, and there's no 50-story buildings. Most of SoHo is landmarked. 70% of SoHo is landmarked. So there's nothing getting built. Out of the 56 blocks that are subject to rezoning, there are 10 in which new tall buildings can be built. And by tall, we mean 27 stories. There are 10 blocks on the periphery of SoHo that will now be allowed to build 27-story
Well, I
buildings.
promise you those 27-story buildings are going to be very popular.
Yes.
Lou, you are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you.